I'm 90 years old. I don't say that lightly. I say it because at this age, there isn't much room left for pretending, and there isn't much patience left for comfort. I'm speaking to you because I don't have the luxury of waiting anymore. What I'm about to say would have sounded unnecessary when I was younger. Now it feels overdue. I lived most of my life believing a simple thing. If I stayed responsible, careful, and financially prepared, everything else would fall into place. That belief didn't come from nowhere. It was taught to me early, by parents who had struggled, by teachers who praised discipline, by co-workers who admired stability. It was repeated so often that it stopped sounding like an opinion and started sounding like a rule. When I chose caution, people approved. When I delayed enjoyment, they called it maturity. When I said no to things that felt unnecessary, they told me I was wise. No one ever warned me that this way of living had a cost that wouldn't show up on paper. They only saw that I was reliable, predictable, and prepared, and I liked that. It felt good to be respected. I believed responsibility was proof of character. I believed planning was the same as living intentionally. I believed saving meant I was protecting my future self. What I didn't realize was that I was also asking my present life to wait indefinitely. So I worked. Not because I loved it, but because it felt like the right thing to do. I saved, not for a specific reason, but because saving was what sensible people did. I planned years ahead, convinced that control was the same as security, and I delayed anything that didn't fit neatly into that structure. Rest was postponed. Relationships were managed, not lived. Small moments were treated as optional, something to return to when the important work was done. I told myself I was building a foundation, that everything meaningful would sit on top of it later. I said things like, after this phase, and once things are settled. I believed those phrases had an end date. I believed there would be a clear moment when I could finally loosen my grip and enjoy what I had built. I didn't notice that the list of things needing attention kept growing, quietly replacing whatever came before it. I convinced myself that slowing down too early was irresponsible, that saying yes too often meant losing focus. That presence was a luxury I hadn't earned yet. I treated time like a resource to be managed carefully, not something that needed to be experienced while it was available. And because nothing went wrong, I never questioned it. There was no crisis to interrupt me, no obvious mistake, just steady progress, modest success, and the reassurance that I was doing things the right way. When life doesn't punish you immediately, you assume your choices are correct. I didn't feel unhappy. That's important to say. I felt stable. I felt composed. I felt like someone who had things under control. Looking back, that's what made it dangerous. There was no alarm, no discomfort loud enough to demand attention. I thought balance could be restored later. I thought time was flexible, that it could be rearranged once the serious matters were handled. I didn't understand that by always prioritizing preparation, I was quietly teaching myself that life itself was something to delay. At the time, it felt safe. It felt adult. It felt responsible. And because it felt that way, I never stopped to ask what I was trading in return. Years passed quietly, not in a way that would have warned me. There were no sharp turns, no clear markers saying something important was slipping away. Days simply followed one another. I woke up at the same time, moved through the same routines, solved the same kinds of problems, and went to bed tired enough to feel justified. That pattern repeated itself so often it began to feel permanent. Work filled most of my attention, not because it demanded passion, but because it demanded consistency. There were deadlines, meetings, responsibilities that always felt slightly urgent. Even when nothing was wrong, there was always something pending, something unfinished, something that required focus. And so my mind stayed there even when my body was somewhere else. Home became a place to recover, not to arrive fully. I ate meals while thinking about what needed to be done the next day. Conversations happened, but they were often partial. I listened, but not completely. I nodded, but my attention drifted. I told myself this was normal. Everyone was busy. Everyone was tired. This was just how adulthood worked. Weekends didn't feel like rest. They felt like maintenance. Errands, repairs, obligations, catching up on what couldn't be done during the week. Time moved faster on those days, not slower. Before I knew it, another week had started, and the cycle continued without resistance. I watched birthdays pass without much reflection. I noticed age only when filling out forms or seeing it written somewhere official. Inside, I felt unchanged. That made it easy to believe that nothing essential was happening, that life was simply moving forward as planned. People around me changed, but slowly enough that it didn't alarm me. Children grew taller, voices deepened, interests shifted. I registered these things the way you notice weather changes, vaguely aware but not truly engaged. I assumed I would have time later to catch up, to reconnect more fully when things calmed down. Years blended together. I struggle now to separate one from another. They share the same texture, the same responsibilities, the same sense of postponement. Looking back, it feels less like a series of choices and more like a long stretch of momentum I never interrupted. I didn't stop to ask if the life I was living required my constant absence. I didn't question why so much of my attention was always allocated elsewhere. I just accepted that this was the cost of being dependable, of being prepared, of being someone who handled things. There were moments that could have slowed me down, a look that lingered longer than expected, a question that deserved more time, an invitation that I declined out of habit, not necessity. Each one was small enough to dismiss. Together, they formed a pattern I didn't recognize until much later. Autopilot is comfortable. That's the truth of it. It removes the need for constant decision-making. It tells you that as long as you're moving forward, you're doing fine. I didn't feel lost. I felt occupied, and that was enough to keep me going without looking too closely. By the time I noticed how much time had passed, it no longer felt like something I could simply reclaim. It felt like something that had already been spent, quietly, without argument, while I was busy keeping everything running. The moment that changed everything didn't arrive with noise or urgency. There was no warning, no dramatic shift. It was an ordinary day that didn't feel important at first. I remember thinking I would be back soon, that there would be other days like it. I was sitting in a hospital room in a chair that wasn't meant to be comfortable. The light was steady. The air smelled clean and faintly unfamiliar. Machines made soft, regular sounds, the kind you stop noticing after a while. Nothing in the room suggested finality. It looked like a place people pass through. Someone I loved was lying in the bed. They looked smaller than I remembered, not weak in a way that felt frightening, just distant, as if part of them had already stepped away. We didn't talk much. There didn't seem to be anything urgent to say. We had shared so many ordinary days that I assumed there would be more. I thought about things I still needed to take care of, calls I had missed, tasks waiting for me outside that room. I told myself I would sit a little while longer, then return later, when I could stay properly. I had learned to think that way. Presence to me was something that could be scheduled. At some point, I noticed the stillness. Not silence exactly, just a subtle absence of movement. A nurse came in quietly. She checked something, adjusted something, then paused. That pause was longer than the others. I understood then, without anyone explaining it. There was no rush of emotion, just clarity, sharp and calm. I realized this was the last time, not the last visit, but the last moment, the kind you never recognize until it's already happening. I stood there, holding a hand that felt warm and familiar, and I understood something I had never allowed myself to think before. There was nothing I could fix, nothing I could prepare, nothing I could trade or arrange or delay. All the careful planning I had done in life had no use in that room. I didn't think about money. I didn't think about the future. I thought about all the times I had chosen to be elsewhere, all the moments I had assumed would repeat, all the conversations I had postponed because they didn't seem urgent. When I left the room, everything outside looked the same. People walked by, phones rang, life continued at its usual pace. That was part of what made it so unsettling. The world hadn't paused, even though something permanent had just happened. From that day on, time felt different. Not shorter, but heavier. Each moment carried a quiet weight I hadn't felt before. I understood, too late, that some things don't announce themselves as final. They only reveal it when there's no chance to respond. That was when I knew that the way I had been living could not protect me from loss. It had only delayed my awareness of it. After that day, life didn't fall apart. It continued. That's what surprised me most. I expected grief to be loud, to interrupt everything. Instead, it settled in quietly and stayed. Days moved forward, but they felt altered, as if something essential had been removed and not replaced. I began noticing absences more than presences, empty chairs, unused cups, times of day that no longer belonged to anyone. These were not dramatic moments. They were ordinary gaps that had suddenly become permanent. My thoughts started returning to the past without invitation, not to the big events but to the small, forgettable ones. A conversation cut short because I was tired. A visit postponed because it wasn't convenient. An evening where I chose to stay late, believing it wouldn't matter in the long run. Those moments came back with clarity, not accusation. There are conversations I will never finish, questions that were never asked, apologies that felt unnecessary at the time. I didn't avoid them out of cruelty. I avoided them because I assumed time would make them easier later. It didn't. It removed them altogether. I think about the sound of laughter that used to fill a room and then slowly stopped, about stories I only heard halfway, about the comfort of familiarity that I took for granted because it felt permanent. None of it announced its departure. It simply faded while I was occupied. I regret the evenings I spent distracted, the meals where I was present in body but not in attention, the habit of telling myself I would make it up someday. You can't make up for absence. You can only notice it once it's complete. There are memories that end abruptly now, not because they were painful, but because I wasn't there long enough to let them fully form. I see myself leaving early, arriving late, standing half-turned toward something else. That's the part that stays with me. I don't blame myself in the way people expect. Blame suggests there was a clear choice. Most of the time there wasn't. There was just momentum, responsibility, the quiet pressure to keep things moving. But regret doesn't need blame to exist. It only needs comparison. And once you see what mattered beside what you gave your time to, the difference is difficult to ignore. I can't go back and choose differently. I can't sit down and be fully present where presence would have changed the tone of a day. All I can do is acknowledge that the cost was real and that it arrived without warning, long after the decisions were made. That understanding stays with me now, steady and unresolved. What I came to understand, slowly and without comfort, was that the things I spent my life protecting were never as fragile as I believed. I treated stability as something that could collapse at any moment if I loosened my grip. I behaved as though one careless choice would undo years of effort. That fear shaped how I moved through the world. The truth revealed itself only after there was nothing left to protect from. The money remained. The accounts were still there. The plans I had made were intact. They didn't disappear when the people did. They didn't weaken when the house grew quieter. They simply existed, unchanged, untouched by the loss that had altered everything else. I had believed these things needed constant attention, that they required sacrifice in order to survive. I was wrong. What required attention were the moments that had no way to repeat themselves. Those moments didn't ask loudly. They didn't demand urgency. They just waited quietly. And when they weren't met, they passed. What actually mattered was not complicated. That was the most difficult part to accept. It wasn't about creating something extraordinary or leaving behind proof of achievement. It was about being available when it counted, sitting longer than necessary, listening without planning a response, staying when leaving would have been easier and more efficient. I used to think presence was passive, something that happened naturally as long as you were nearby. I see now that presence is a choice, and often an inconvenient one. It requires you to set aside the feeling that something else needs your attention. It asks you to accept that not everything important can be scheduled or optimized. I sacrificed those moments because they didn't feel productive. They didn't move anything forward in a visible way. I didn't understand that they were moving something inward, quietly building connection and trust in ways that can't be replaced once they're gone. I also learned that people don't need you at your best. They need you when you're available, tired, unprepared, undistracted. I spent too much time waiting to be in the right state to show up properly. That state rarely arrived. The contrast became painfully clear. I had protected what could endure while neglecting what was temporary. I assumed permanence where there was none and treated permanence as though it were at risk. By the time I recognized the mistake, it no longer offered a chance to adjust. What remains now is not anger or bitterness. It's a clear understanding of value, arrived at too late to be useful to me. I see how little was required. Not grand gestures, not dramatic changes. Just attention given when it was asked for instead of deferred. This realization doesn't bring peace, it brings accuracy. And accuracy, at this stage of life, is all that's left. I'm speaking to you now not because I think your life looks wrong from the outside, but because I recognize the way it probably feels from the inside. I know the language you use to justify your days. I know how reasonable it all sounds. I use the same words. I trusted them. You tell yourself you're doing what you have to do, that this period is demanding but temporary, that once you reach a certain point, things will ease up. You believe you're being responsible, not avoidant, that you're prioritizing stability, not postponing life. From where you stand, that distinction feels important. You might be telling yourself that people understand, that they know you're busy, that they'll still be there when things slow down. I told myself that too. I assumed understanding meant patience without limit. I didn't realize that patience can expire quietly. You probably think presence is something you can offer later, when you're less tired or less distracted. You believe the important conversations can wait because nothing is wrong yet. I thought that way for decades. I never considered that nothing being wrong was exactly what made those moments irreplaceable. Time feels abundant when you're surrounded by plans. It feels forgiving when deadlines keep renewing themselves. It feels flexible when tomorrow looks similar to today. That's what makes delay so easy. It doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like a postponement without consequence. I'm not asking you to abandon what you're building. I'm asking you to notice what you're repeatedly setting aside. The dinners shortened, the calls delayed, the invitations declined without much thought. Those patterns matter more than any single decision. You may believe that awareness will come when something changes, when a loss forces clarity. That's what I believed. I didn't understand that clarity can arrive after the window to act has already closed. For me, that window is gone. I live with the understanding that certain moments required my attention when I still had the option to give it. I didn't see that then. I see it now. For you, the outcome is not decided yet. That doesn't mean it will be easy. It only means the choices are still unfolding, not in some distant future, but in the way you move through today and the way you treat what's in front of you right now. I can't tell you how it will feel later. I can only tell you how it feels to realize, too late, that the reasons you gave yourself were logical, accepted, and ultimately insufficient.